complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like messed up.
All right, Ronald Dodson, welcome to the show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, definitely. You are someone that I don't think my audience might have heard of because you write, but you're not necessarily someone who's been in the same podcast sphere that I have. But you and I have been talking for a good while in a sort of behind the scenes group chat with some other Christian guys from our scene. We also appeared on one of Kryptos's podcasts that I think went quite well. But could you kind of describe who you are and how you got started in this scene?
Absolutely. I'm a hedge fund manager in the statistical vol arb space. And I'll put your listeners completely to sleep if I discuss exactly what that entails. But I trade a lot of derivatives. The short of it is I try to provide equity-like returns with bond-like volatility of returns. And that's been a successful career. I've been doing that since the mid-90s. And then my business partner on the hedge fund side is Nate Fisher, who's the founder of New Founding and American Reformer and some other things. And Nate's been quite the voice on the right of the past few years. And we got to be just really close friends. And he and then another friend of mine, Daryl Cooper, both just really encouraged me to both write and start getting my voice out there. I've spoken a lot in Dallas, where I live. Used to have a Sunday school class of a couple of hundred people, and speak several speaking engagements a month. And they were like, you need to spread your wings and broaden your horizon a little bit. And so I've done that, and it's the response has been fun, a little strange, but fun. Again, I just I've appreciated getting to know you and our mutual friends, and love your show.
Well, thanks, man. I think that's possibly the most, I guess, like the biggest sign that this whole thing is going places is that I'm continually encountering new people who are highly competent and interesting that I've absolutely never crossed paths with before. You get this feeling that like it just kind of keeps going. And so
it's great. I feel the same way.
The most recent person that I've sort of discovered is Athenian Stranger, right? Who's been on my podcast recently, will be again soon. And, he does incredibly good work, kind of analyzing the classics. And I had just never even heard of him, until a few months ago. And so that kind of continual feeling that like, there is someone in our scene or vaguely connected who is an absolute expert at almost anything. It's incredibly intoxicating, right? Because, coming from kind of regular conservative America, growing up on talk radio, where it felt like, there's only a limited number of players in the game, right? And even within that game, what you can talk about is very, very limited, not just in the level of content, right? You're limited by broadcast radio, but also just everything is, that simple kind of daily grind of, political reaction. And so, getting to a place where it's like, this is still very much the political right. There's no denying that, but there are, an incredible depth of impressive people. It's really fun. It's intoxicating.
Well, to that point, because of what I do, which amounts to staring at multiple computer screens with squiggly lines on them all day, every day, for years and years, just recently, but honestly has given me time to do a lot of reading and analysis and so forth. But just recently, again, I mentioned Nate Fisher. He encouraged me. The New Founding created kind of an open office concept. So I moved my hedge fund operation to basically an open office floor. It was kind of like back in my first hedge fund job on a trading floor, where it's I'm around other guys who are super highly competent. There's always ideas going. If I need to get on the phone, I'll put on my headphones and go into a secluded office if I have to. But otherwise, the energy and the interaction. Intoxicating is a good word, but it also just reminds me how infinitely deep the kingdom is. Just there's always somebody to meet and to get to know who has this infinite depth of knowledge, competence, life experience, story, and that is, I maybe I love people too much, but it's great. It's been so encouraging. I feel 20 years younger just because I'm around uh, other competent, highly capable people.
Certainly. So you sent me a list of topics to discuss, and I try to avoid talking about sort of the story of the day. But recently, a controversy has sort of ripped through the right about one, the phrase, you know, Christ is Lord. And then on the other hand, this idea that, you know, people of other religions, specifically religious Jews, should convert to Christianity. And, there's a certain angle from this, which is like a theological debate, which we may or may not get into. But I think the other one is that it sort of shows a broader divide between two kind of generations of the right. And so I'm curious, right? Like, why did you bring up this topic as one to discuss for this episode?
Well, the Christ is King thing, first of all, that seems very Christ is King. That proclamation is the gospel, and so as evangelicals or those who take the faith seriously would be more inclined to believe the words of Scripture. That's kind of basic. So there's all these things that in the larger, call it Christian nationalism debate, that just seem like a recovery of basic Christianity. So part of it was that it seems on the one hand interesting, but on the other hand almost you know banal, or but the more important thing was that it reminded me a lot of the lordship salvation debates that were raging in the early 90s. Now, I just turned 57, so I remember the early 90s. And it was in evangelical land, it was all the big argument was you had, kind of this free grace movement led by a lot of Bible churchy dispensationalists and a guy named Zane Hodges and his acolytes, which really had a much bigger pull than their numbers would suggest. And then there was the kind of John MacArthur in his younger days who said, "Well, no, of course, Jesus is Lord," and all this. Anyway, the point is, it that debate raged for about 5 years. Books written on both sides, a lot of feelings hurt, so on and so forth, but it really didn't change the discussion outside those circles. And my one of the reasons I brought this up as a topic is, do we really, as Christians, is this a central part of our faith that, yeah, Christ is King? To me, it seems like it's kind of the central, the preamble to the Great Commission says all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Therefore, so in other words, the whole basis for going and doing anything is based on his actualized, real, in history authority. And I hear a lot of guys say, "Well, it's a spiritual kingdom," and that's code for not real. And it gets real, what does spiritual even mean? So that was one of the reasons I brought it up. Is that it seems like the gospel is a political proclamation, and you can't get away from that. But that makes a lot of Christians nervous because they've been taught that you can't mix religion and politics, and so
Well, and it's interesting. We hear that phrase all the time in politics, right? The separation of church and state. Uh, but Ron, you'll notice that is nowhere written in law, right? It is sort of
No.
a vague prescription of ideas we like to stick to. I believe that comes from a letter between two of the founding fathers. I cannot remember the name of them off the top of my head. Anyone at home could find it quickly with Google search. But the
Believe
point,
it was believe it was Jefferson, but I could be wrong.
that sounds right. It sounds like something he would have said, so we'll go with it.
It absolutely sounds like something he would have said in his very French leaning.
Yeah, really, like the filthy Francophile. I actually quite like Jefferson, but for the sake of argument, I don't. Anyway, back to the point at hand. Right? In that, it's sort of, this is not something that was ever really invoked before the last 60, 70 years. Right? Our forefathers understood that Christian virtue, Christian ethic had a strong political element to it. Right? Obviously, there was disagreement on how to apply that. Even within the American context, it was a generally Christian ethic. Right? There was no specific state church, although there were state churches in different states. There was no national church, but the ethic was sort of broadly Northern European Protestant. Right? Obviously, there were
right.
Catholics, more so over time.
Well,
But
even
that was
a whole state, Maryland.
true, although Ryan Turnipseed corrected me recently that is sort of overstated in history. I believe there was a rebellion of, I believe it was Puritans. It sounds again like Puritans. We'll blame them.
Well, don't get me disagreeing with Ryan because he's encyclopedic in his knowledge of that era. So whatever he says, I'll salute.
Well, sir, exactly. And so, but the reason I bring it up, right, is that in a previous era, this argument was never made. It is an innovation in the American context, and it's a deliberately ideological tool, right? That is in very few cases invoked as a good faith argument. What it basically means is you can't bring your religion in, but I can bring mine. This sort of social religion we see that has many of the sort of same features, right? It sort of attaches to your immune system in the same way that a religion does, but it doesn't tick the legal box, so it doesn't count. And I think that, when we look at, the application of law, many people who are sort of more conservative minded than you and I get all in a tizzy about it isn't fair. It isn't fair. The rules aren't being applied in an equal, non-ideological way. And I think one of the real innovations from our sphere, is this realization that there is no neutral society. And the pre-existing order was biased towards broadly Protestant ethics. Does that mean everyone was a Protestant Christian? Certainly not. Does that mean there weren't areas in the country that were dominated by Catholics or dominated by Mormons? Again, certainly not. But the idea that this was just this sort of null state where no religion was enforced, where there was just this kind of blank slate view of, every single person was, kind of free to decide their own morality is fiction, completely so. Not only because it's not historically true, but it's impossible for such a system to exist.
Well, backing up a little bit, even that first letter, it was a one-way mirror, so to speak. The funds, there were federal funds going to state churches and independent churches, and the idea there was that there would be a wall of separation of authority, that the government wouldn't basically become a House of Lords where the bishops all determined what the local parishes were going to do. And so that's your separation of church and state. It's between it's the federal government was funding churches, and there were established state churches. There wasn't a national establishment, but there were established churches in each state. And the opinion of the letter was, look, there's this wall of separation from a federal level that won't we won't exert authority in the way, for instance, you see in the commingling in England. And then second of all, I write for American Reformer, and one of the articles that's been published there has been tremendously eye-opening about Madison's thinking. He wanted to factionalize the churches, and that kind of hurts my soul, being wanting to think that the U.S. Constitution and it was delivered, it and the Magna Carta were delivered from on high, just below scripture level. But Madison has, it was shown by the research that he really, even though he was a Witherspoon guy, he wanted the church factionalized to limit its power. And so you have some real, it wasn't even from the beginning, it wasn't a monolithic understanding of how this was all going to work. And so I think that exactly what you said, it was a broadly Protestant ethic that informed everything. The government, I like to tell everyone, we have a Baptist populace and a Presbyterian government, and populated by a lot of Anglicans. And but that's a Protestant construct. But as far as how priest and king were to interact wasn't as cut and dried as the way it's been made in modernity is just, as you said, a tool for the left to drive a wedge.
And I think that's something that, I'm broadly frustrated with sort of normal good conservatives. And I don't say that in any sort of punitive way, right? They're sort of they're operating off old software. This was the way that you work, that you went about your life in a more functional society where you do expect to be treated in good faith, right? You expect that when someone levels an insult at you, like racist, that is something you can disprove, right? There is something you can do to kind of make your case. But much like, the kind of point about church and state, a lot of these things are purely ideological. There's almost no substance to it outside of just, I don't like you, go away, effectively. Or actually not even go away. I don't like you and I want to punish you. And I think that's, I guess, kind of one of the interesting things you mentioned in your notes, Schmidt as well, this idea of, the friend enemy distinction.
Yes.
And Schmidt is often misread. There's this
Yes.
idea that, the friend enemy distinction, having enemies is based in cool.
Right.
His point is not that. His point is that when you see a social breakdown, society becomes entirely predicated on friends and enemies. And I think the position to take is, we are in a situation of social breakdown. Therefore, it has become friends and enemies. Not, this is a good thing, but it is simply how you operate in a society that is, coming apart at the seams.
Well, the Schmidt, I find Schmidt wildly both prophetic and wise, and his being maligned is frustrating, to say the least. I'm working through the Nomos of the Earth right now, and he's all the scholarship says, well, he had a very troubled relationship with the church, and who knows if he believed anything or whatever. Nomos of the Earth, he comes out, he's very clear where his allegiance lies. That is probably his last major work, and it isn't widely read, but he was, at least in a covenantal sense, was he, as we evangelicals would say, was he a saved guy? I have no idea what the condition of his heart was, but he was certainly a covenantal Christian, working in that worldview. And what I find so insightful in discussing this friend enemy distinction is his reliance on Christ's ethic of enmity. And Christ's ethic of enmity is that you, as a follower of Jesus, you have to love your personal enemies. There's a distinction made between the public and the personal, and we see this lived out with Jesus. If someone came to him or had a private conversation with him or had personal interaction, he was he was generally gracious. Even if he had hard words to say, he was gracious and kind. But he had public enemies who he had no quarter for. And you see the same ethic with later with Paul. But this makes, and Schmidt discusses this at length, of the distinction between the private enemy and the public enemy. And so this makes, while I found Schmidt incredibly insightful in discussing this, and it's been a topic, this ethic, Jesus' ethic of enmity, it's a topic that is hardly touched on in historical theology. There's a bishop in the Catholic Church, I think, that dealt with it 400 or 500 years ago, but otherwise it's hardly touched upon. But it makes perfect sense. And I made the example I used to teach about it is, if, let's say, I'm working at Lockheed or at Boeing, and we're making the next fighter jet for America, and I'm working on the wing assembly. I'm a pilot, so maybe that's why I gravitated to this example. But I'm an engineer. I'm working on the wing assembly, and the chief designer of the entire program comes and says, "Hey, it's time for us to build the airplane. You need to get together with the fuselage engineer so that we can see how this is all going to mate up, and we've got to build the jigs so that we can make these things." And I say to the lead engineer, I said, "Well, the fuselage guy stole my sandwich in the commissary. I don't want to deal with him." Well, the lead engineer is going to say, I don't care if what kind of personal beef, we've got a plane to make. But on the other hand, if I said, and it were true that the fuselage guy is leaking the designs to the Chinese, then you say, well, now we've got a public enemy that we have to deal with. So Jesus is dealing, his followers, we're called in 1 Peter 2:9 a royal priesthood. Well, the word in Hebrew is for priest is Kohen, and that literally means palace servant. And we're servants of Christ, or supposed to be at least. And a servant's personal beefs are generally meaningless. Go work those out. Go figure those out on your own time, but they're not part of the bigger project. The enemies of the kingdom matter. So Schmidt took that kernel of Jesus' ethic, and understanding that, explained an entire political theology on how relationships in a political reality should work and should be viewed. And I just find it breathtaking in both its simplicity and its wisdom.
It reminds me very much of a debate we had several months ago. I realize that's ancient history on the internet, but about the idea of no enemies to the right, abbreviated netter, which is basically that same principle. That they're inside.
Charles Haywood, fantastic human being. Love Charles.
And his formulation was basically that same idea. That there are inside and there are outside problems. And so when it comes to inside problems, people who are pulling the same direction as you, if you have beef, settle it personally and settle it privately.
That's right.
Don't turn it into essentially an opening. And your point about the selling secrets to the Chinese is exactly that, right? Like, okay, like if someone stole your metaphorical sandwich, someone stepped on your toes, someone did something that you consider sort of in bad taste, right? Obviously, that does need to be handled, right? Things need to be managed, but that is not the same level of issue as someone basically selling everyone out. The accusation fed in these circles is, almost if you get labeled with that, it's basically, you're done. And it's that exact point, right? Like, are you allied with the enemy? And that's I think that applies.
Well, that's allegiance, and allegiance is everything. Salvation, pistis, the word we translate as faith, from the Koine Greek. Pistis literally means, we translate it belief and all these things, but it's really allegiance. You can't have allegiance without belief, without mental assent, without all these things. But it's, I'm aligned, I'm allied And so I'm sorry to step on you, but this is a critical point for both the church, but also for political theology, for us to understand allegiance. That is of immense importance.
Exactly. And that really is that idea of, when we talk about this culture war, this political struggle being a war of belief, it is a war of uh, allegiance, right? It is who do you serve? And I'm never one to make kind of sweeping statements about kind of like angels and demons. It comes across as a little performative to me. But when I look at when I look at, for instance, what you see with the sort of like drag time story hour, with the sort of the totemic importance of abortion, of, what is essentially child sacrifice, and
Right.
that sort of truly satanic and, like Milton's sense, obsession with, self-rule, of a decisionism, right? The idea decisionism is an idea from Schmidt. That's not what I meant. But this idea that I will rule over myself no matter what.
Right. Atomized decisionism.
Exactly. And, that sort of as the like complete end goal, the whole raison d'etre for human existence. And you compare that to, what you believe, what I believe, what our friends believe. And it's like, well, this is truly a political situation where there is no synthesis, right? These are mutually incompatible ends.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think what we're talking about is, there's this tension, a tension that's necessary, but there's a uncomfortable tension right now in the online dissident right between the, uh, call it the serious Christians, uh, be they, Catholic, Ortho Bros, or Reformed, and the kind of the Nietzschean right. But I think what Nietzsche, and I'm of the opinion that Nietzsche was driven at first by lament. I read the God is dead passage and I see it through shed tears. Maybe I'm naive, but that's how it struck me the first time, and I've not been able to shake that. But it is it is we who have killed him, and what can, if you kill God, you better be ready to be a god yourself, and you're not up to the task, basically. And this lament, I think, is somewhat satisfied with a more mature, grown-up understanding of the New Testament ethic as explained by Jesus. We didn't even mention Matthew 18, which speaks of this personal versus public enmity, because remember, if somebody does something that is wrong, or that you don't like, what's the command? You go to them privately. You deal with it. You deal with it personally. You don't let it turn let it turn into a cancer that disrupts the whole. So, but anyway, I think this more mature understanding that is throughout the New Testament, a New Testament that has a serrated edge, so to speak. I mean, you hear Paul, who says to the Judaizers, when you circumcise, I wish you'd gone the whole way, or cut the whole thing off so you wouldn't reproduce. This, I think, meets some of the lament of the Nietzscheite wing. The problem is American Christianity has been so dominated by precious, I don't even know if anyone knows what precious moments is anymore, but this kind of syrupy, sweet sentimentalism, as opposed to kind of a more Cormac McCarthy flavored, mature view of what the project is. I think there would be a lot more commonality. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
It does, and I think that you're right to kind of pick at that sentimentality. That there's this idea, and it's never one that's kind of explicitly stated, but even Lewis attacks this, so it shows that kind of the rot existed even then, in the 40s. That to be a Christian is to be a vaguely pleasant person, to not rock the boat, to sort of be nice to be around.
Right.
And not only is that not true when we look at the history of the church, when we look at kind of the saints, the people in Scripture, but also that is not the kind of waters we swim in.
Right.
I speak often about the kind of decline of mainline Protestant churches. And, this term evangelical is sort of a catch-all. It means, half a dozen different things to half a dozen different people. And most of the time is used as a pure kind of pejorative. But if we
Right.
take that, the kind of broadest sense, which is that evangelical just means, conservative Protestants,
Yes.
right? In opposition to the mainline. And the mainline churches are most of those that were connected to traditional American institutions. They have become kind of social clubs for libtards, to be brutally honest about it. And it's
That's right.
because that same logic of, just being generally pleasant, kind of focusing entirely on social acceptability, focus entirely on respectability. And we see where that trap is led. And so to stand in the position we're in, to stand in the gate and basically say like, oh, well, I just want to be generally pleasant. You look down that slippery slope. The slippery slope remains the undefeated champion of the 21st century. And you see what we've run this experiment relatively recently. Like within my lifetime, we've seen this happen. Who were the first groups making, or are presiding over, gay weddings, right? These are in many ways very related congregations to maybe the ones that you or I go, simply ones that have kind of decided to compromise earlier. And so
That's
to me,
right.
I have almost no patience for that premise of respectability taken to its kind of most common endpoint.
Well, it's respectability perverted because, of course, to be fair, the Bible says that elders are not to be quarrelsome. So don't go looking for a fight. And I always tell people, you don't have to look for a fight. The fight's going to, if you actually believe this stuff, the fight's going to find you. You don't need to go looking for it. But also respectability in a more mature culture, social construct, respectability would value the correct things. But somehow, I started to mention this earlier, but I think American conservatism somewhere along the line just became a watered down progressivism. If we believe, kind of the new nomenclature of Posawid, the purpose of a system is what it does. Well, conservatism just is progressivism on a lower RPM. And I don't know what flicked that switch. Maybe Reconstruction. I really don't know, but it's something that's been troubling me because what do conservatives actually conserve? Instead, it's taken a bunch of us more principled rightists, or those concerned with, I'll kind of use Curtis Yarvin's definition of that. The chief goal being order. I mean, that seems scriptural to me. We serve a God of order, not of chaos, or God of peace, not of disorder, from 1 Corinthians 14. That it's taken these quote unquote reactionaries to call conservatives to the carpet for not conserving anything. But I don't know. I honestly don't know when that went off the rails. Maybe it was World War II, because and the election just after with Taft and Eisenhower. And you know, uh, uh, I think Eisenhower really grew in wisdom in office. His farewell speech, I think, is brilliant. He seems like he was a decent and serious man. But obviously, as a man of the right, Taft seemed to be more along our way of thinking, at least in principle. So I don't know where that switch happened. You have any? You seem to mention maybe the 1930s.
Well,
You
see,
have any thoughts on that?
I blame FDR for everything,
It's not a bad place to start.
but I think that there's a psychological root to this. So, I was meeting with a couple guys in our scene weekend before last, And I came to discover that a great many ideas I thought were original were actually from BAP, and I do not listen to BAP directly, so I just picked them up through osmosis. But he makes this distinction between the conservative and the reactionary, right? So you've probably heard of these kind of like big four personality indicators, right? They're kind of big in pop psychology for a while. I think they're actually based in relatively decent science and psychometrics if you're into that thing. But one of those is this idea of there are two traits. One is conscientiousness and one is openness. Right. And conscientiousness is basically, can you set goals and meet them? Right. Your executive function. Traditionally, people who describe themselves as conservative are very high in that metric. People who describe themselves as liberal, very low. But there's another one, right, which is open-mindedness. Now, traditionally, obviously, you can imagine liberals are very open-minded. But the reactionary, right, someone like us, tends to be both very conscientious. They have that right-wing kind of spirit to them, but also open-minded, right? They're willing to break social convention. That's right. Quick, you and I have already mentioned, a half dozen topics which break social taboos rather seriously. Now, I think that's part of it. I think that the conservative instinct is sort of a human psychological response. You're not getting around that. That instinct exists in all time, and it's, generally a healthy thing for society. But again, going back to our point about the friend enemy distinction, we are not in a healthy society, right? That kind of conservative impulse no longer serves. And so we do need, on one hand, both a sense of order, right? We serve a God of order, like you said, and also, right, we need to shake up the existing social order. It's become moribund. It's decaying. So that's part of it. Now, when does the rot start? This is something that it's hard to say, right? Someone would say, the kind of in the cyclical history idea, this is simply the course that empires take, right? They tend to decay. It's sort of an entropy.
Sure.
Now, the more arch reactionaries, reactionary with a capital R, if you will, someone like de Maistre would basically say, like, this is all downstream of the Enlightenment, right? That's when we sort of began to abandon it. But, as much as I like de Maistre, I think that I can imagine a world in which the Enlightenment doesn't send us all to hell in a handbasket. I can imagine a world in which there's sort of a synthesis from that works. I mean, I guess maybe, if we're talking about the 30s, that was really when sort of managerialism began to creep and take over the world, right? Burnham has this point that effectively, the Soviet Union, the NSDAP, and the government of FDR are three competing systems sort of working in the same way, right? The idea that you will manage human populations at scale.
That's right.
And, you and I might have our preferences between those three empires, right? We won ultimately. But nonetheless, I think that idea, that effectively you can engineer society to meet a certain ideological standard. I mean, really, I think that's the reason that the 20th century was such an absolute unmitigated disaster, both when it comes to the loss of human life and also the separation of man from culture, to kind of roughly paraphrase Yaki.
Wow. No, that's very good. I didn't know we were going to get into Yaki. That's very good. Burnham making that point, when I read that, I immediately thought of, what would the Byzantines say? Because the Byzantines had this, what would you call it, proto-managerialism? And what was the effect there? Well, slow decay and rot, right? So, I don't know. I know enough about the history to sound like an idiot when I talk to guys who are much better than that. At some point though, and let's just keep it to the United States, the Daryl Cooper makes the point that we had to fill up the Western United States with at least some people, or somebody else was going to take it, right? So you had to have this. I tend to relate the fall to being kind of a philosophical cosmopolitanism. And that was possibly a necessary, I use necessary in quotes, result of the fact that we just had to import a crap load of people in order to fill the place up. And so maybe it was inevitable, or you were going to have somebody else in the western half of the country taking it over, from take your pick. And I see that, but does mass migration always equal destruction of culture? Does cosmopolitanism always mean that what ties people together, this 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 sinew of faith and culture and proximity and commonality of experience, does it always destroy that? And it seems like the answer is yes. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Bronze Age collapse seems to be driven by, the sea people's mass migration, right? So if that's the case, that would seem to, okay, we're getting a little far afield, but that would seem to say that, okay, we need to go back to a sphere of influence, geopolitical and foreign policy reality. Well, do you see anyone, even on a generally conservative side, going to argue for that? No, we need to continue being the empire of the world. And if that's the case, then we're going to continue this cosmopolitan experiment, and that's going to just continue to accelerate the decline. I don't know. That's kind of how I think through these things. I don't know if that's right, but that's how I've made sense of it. And I think that the managerialism was a natural response to the facts on the ground. In Russia, you had an empire that was falling apart, and multiple peoples that needed to be managed together. So you had this soft empire of managerialism that replaced the hard empire of the czars. In the United States, you had all these disparate people over a large area. Again, similar kind of thing. The example where I might disagree a bit with Burnham, and I realize I'm stepping into dangerous ground when you do that, is with Germany. I just think that example has some features of it, but some of these, but it was an explicit rejection of cosmopolitanism. Still had some of the managerialist aspects, but I don't know. That's how I've tried to make sense of it.
I think there's something to that, and obviously, Burnham was writing with controlled information.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? We have sort of the benefit of hindsight that he lacked, and again, I think that just to clarify for the listeners, I'm presenting that as a possible thesis. If we're talking about like where does this rot come from? I have to admit that I think that I am perhaps most sympathetic to the kind of cyclical history view of it. Going back to scripture,
Spengler.
Right? We exactly, we see this kind of cycle of empire over and over and over again, right? Specifically with the king of Israel, where there's this sort of pattern of, you have a good king, he reigns well, he has a son that's an absolute disaster, he abandons God. And then, a generation passes and they're taken into captivity. This is sort of a repeated motif.
Right.
Over
Judges.
and over again. Exactly. The book of Judges. And I think that, and this goes back to our earlier mentioning of dispensationalism, that we sort of have to realize that we are not special with an asterisk. Right. From a technological perspective, right, you and I live in the most unprecedented run on the stock market the world has ever seen. Right. The amount of change that, someone, let's just say, who's in their 80s right now has lived through is almost entirely unprecedented.
It's breathtaking.
So that's unique. Well, I'll grant you that. But on the other hand, right, the same forces that affect human organization, the same forces that affect human nature are sort of baked into the cake. Right. You can't get around that. And so what is wrong about the sort of managerial view of society, right? It's the idea that you can engineer human nature. You can engineer these sort of entropic forces of organization out of existence, right? You can create a new Soviet man. So we know that's not true. But I think that we mentally reject that, but on the inside still kind of hold it's true. And so we look at something like America, we assume that, when America dies, when America not even dies, when it goes from being an empire to, let's just say, a normal country again, right? That is the light going out, that civilization is done, and you see this in kind of the kookiest dispensationalist view of the end times, right? That America goes under and then it is literally the battle of Armageddon. And
Right.
I think that, to me, I look at this as, something that had a lifespan and is, sort of unraveling, and I'm not even entirely sure it would be a good thing for it to keep going. It's sort of internal contradictions had got to the point where it isn't functioning well, and maybe it's easy to say now when the lights still work, at least most of the time. And, I've only had one airplane that had serious issues, but, nothing fatal. So maybe it's easy to say now, but nonetheless, I think that there needs to be a recognition that, like, something that was once good can become, sort of maladjusted. It become, sclerotic. And, just like it's sometimes sad, but you need to put down a dog. Maybe the American Empire is something that needs to be put down, to be brutally honest.
There is nothing eternal. You look at a map of the United States, there is nothing eternal about that. We're not promised. It is a temporal reality. I was part of a discussion, a year and a half ago, with some folks we'd all know, and the argument, the consensus among the group was that in 500 to 1,000 years, the only thing that will be remembered about the United States is the name of Neil Armstrong. And that may be an exaggeration, but that's at least possibly true. And yet, look at how I'll go into my German NASA was best NASA if I'm not careful. But we don't even do that anymore. I mean, Elon's kind of taken it upon himself to put that whole thing on his back. But what happened to this people who had so much strength in and of themselves that they looked heavenward and they wanted to explore not only the skies and space, but the oceans and everything. When I was a kid, there were submarine shows and space shows and it was there were fins on the cars, and I just see us. It's a sign of cultural decline that we are so navel gazy and so inward. When you go out and look around, and not to sound like a mystic, or maybe to sound like a mystic, but you go and look at the sky at night if you're not in the middle of the city. I mean, unfortunately, I get a lot of light pollution where I am, but I still pull my telescope out. I've got a little, 12-inch reflector over here in the corner of my office, and I'll take it out. And I remember the first time I showed the kids, they got to see the rings of Saturn, and then we panned around and they saw Jupiter and the 4 largest moons. And that sense of awe, and that you're a small part of something much bigger than yourself, and more important, that it's not just about you, and that's a good thing. Getting back to the Nietzschean Lament, that's been lost, and that's profoundly sad to me. But I see and I hear, and have gotten to be friends with a ton of guys as part of this online dissident right movement that want to recapture it. And that's exciting to me, not just because they're all, without fail, seem to be really great folks, but that's the culture needs that, just to look outside of itself. Looking inside of yourself ends up with the 27% of young people identifying as some kind of sexual oddity. looking outside of yourself gets you aligned with reality. So
Ron, I think that's a good place to end it. We're coming up on time, but if people want to find more of you and more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, I'm at Ron Dodson on Twitter. And I write for American Reformer, which is a fantastic, it's a great journal. And then you can find me at Ron Dodson. My Substack is called The Eyes of Apelles, which is a reference to the last chapter of Romans. And I write about all kinds of stuff there. That's about it, unless you want to look me up on YouTube, but that's all guitar stuff, which we haven't touched on, thankfully.
Well, definitely, man. I'm looking forward to your writing in the future. I've read your articles and got quite a bit from them. So I was really glad to have you on the show. And as far as my stuff, if you guys want to find more episodes of the Jay Burden Show, you can do so on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to episodes. And if you want to support our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, he's a great guy. JD is legitimately frightening. And in addition to that, he's actually quite intelligent and good at his job. So you should head over there, join the group chat. You can see what I'm lifting and see if you're stronger than me. And again, Ron, thank you so much, man.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.